All right, good morning, everyone. Welcome to Can You Trust Me Now, an exploration into the mobile threat landscape. You're in South Seas CDF for this talk. Before we begin, there's a few notes. Stop by the business hall located in Bayside AB during the day for the welcome reception from 5:30 to 7 p.m. tonight. The Black Hat Arsenal is on the Palm Foyer on level 3. Join us for the Pony Awards in Mandalay Bay BCD at 6:30. And thanks everyone for putting their phone on vibrate. Keep the noise down for everyone. So Josh Thomas and Sean Moyer will talk to you about Can You Trust Me Now?
Cool. That's gonna spill. Cool. I am Josh Thomas. I've been doing mobile security research for about 6 years, full security research for about 16 now. We'll get into more in a bit, but my background is development. This is kind of how I came into security, was through development, as opposed to Sean.
Yeah, and I'm Sean Moyer, about 20 years in information security. We both work for a firm called the Tretis Partners. We're actually two of the founders of the company. And kind of, at a high level, kind of big picture, where this talk sort of comes from is, I think of a lot of the talks at Black Hat, and I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing, but they tend to be very focused on individual vulnerabilities and kind of myopic, like really focused on, a bug and what that bug means in terms of, its discovery and, nursing it along until it's a reliable exploit and all that. And that's great. But a lot of what happens, I think, a lot of the times in our world is we talk to people about mobile security across the board. We've done, at this point, assessments of pretty much every single mobile vendor at an OS, hardware, firmware level, all the way down into baseband exploitation, things like that. And so we get asked the question of, what is mobile security good, better, worse, than desktop security? Where is that across the board? And we all sort of bemusedly talk about how much we trust our phones now, right? And how important our phones are, right? And so this is just kind of the attempt here to look at the big picture of where all of this sits across the board.
And I mean, we wanted to give just because it's something we do every day, we've kind of grown with the mobile industry. Mobile, as far as InfoSec is concerned, used to be this little corner that not many people talked about or were interested in, and now it's pretty mainline. Like, now we care. And so we kind of wanted to give an overview of just, if you are new to the space, this is where you start. If you are not new to the space, but you're new to hardware, this is where you start. The goal is to have some new information to you, no matter how deep your technical prowess is in mobile already.
And yeah, I guess sort of an additional intent too is to contextualize the rest of the mobile track, because we have, a number of mobile talks that are kind of broader observations on the platform, but they're still observations on a single platform. And then, of course, a lot of, like I say, very specific mobile exploitation talks. So, what does, a trust zone exploit versus a baseband exploit versus an iOS exploit sort of mean in context of the entire mobile landscape? So
what do those words even mean?
What do those words mean? I don't know.
Cool.
So yeah, our focus is to start at the overall model for what is the mobile trusted computing, base look like? What does it look like? Mobile security architecture across the board, all the way down into some of the things that are unique to mobile that aren't specific to, that are common across all mobile devices, that are a little different from the way desktops and laptops work, right? And any talk about mobile right now also, is clearly going to be in part about BYOD and how that applies in the context of every enterprise's security, because it's pretty much the common practice at this point,
Then we'll shift from there into kind of the hardware landscape, just what hardware on a cell phone actually looks like. Like, what are the components? How do they work? What are they responsible for? Where's the interesting weak points? Mm-hmm. And then we'll kind of wrap up with MDM, which is completely on the other side of the spectrum from a hardware layer. Yeah. I think that'll be fun. So, one question for the audience. How many people only brought a cell phone to Black Hat?
So desktop, well, obviously, unless you're a gamer, you probably didn't lug your desktop here. But your corporate laptops are actually at home. right? So just a phone, right? And I hear that comment from people a lot over the last few years, that we've got to the point where we can do, 99% of our work activity, right, and our social activity and all of that on a mobile device. It's not a full-blown laptop desktop replacement yet, but it's fairly close, especially for, something where you're kind of semi-work mode like here.
But I mean, we tend to not think of the phones when we're actually holding them and using them as a desktop or a laptop replacement, right? They're this kind of secondary thing that's convenience, but we just tend to forget how much data is actually there and how interesting they are. Okay, cool. So this is the stack of everything that you can fiddle and play with as far as mobile security. So we'll start just kind of walking through the stack and kind of explaining the useful or interesting things for you to know as we kind of run through how code executes on a phone and where it executes. So the first thing that we're all really familiar with is the app layer, right? This is the App Store. This is all your email data on your phone. That has been covered very well to the point of almost ad nauseum at this point. There will be a lot of great talks on protecting at the app layer later on today, and we're going to pretty much just skim over it. So, as far as the OS, right, these aren't OSs that have never been used before. I mean, pretty much we're talking about QNX, we're talking about Unix, and I mean, these are OSs that from a server or a desktop or a laptop perspective, we already pretty much get. They've been tweaked for mobile, but they're pretty much the same thing.
Yeah, and I guess there are, I've actually given talks numerous times where people from Nokia have walked up afterwards and said, you forgot us, we exist. So there are things like Symbian and BBOS that were like built, more, and of course, BlackBerry OS still has sort of the lineage of QNX, but there are OSs that were built, from the ground up for mobile, but yeah, by and large, you're looking at a lot of the same fundamentals from Windows itself or from POSIX or things like that. So these are small Unix operating systems, really, in most cases.
So, I mean, and with the Unix operating system, we really care about two things, right? We care about what version of the OS we're running and what version of the kernel, because that's pretty much where we're able to baseline our security expectations. And the goal is just to be as fresh as possible. So the next place that comes in, and we don't see this near as much with laptops or anything like that, you have OEMs. So, I mean, I guess your laptop vendors write crap bloatware that you end up uninstalling.
Dell and HP like pre-install some, random apps, and make your default search Bing or something like that, right?
And I mean,
this is a bit beyond that.
It's a bit beyond that because the hardware is kind of agnostic to the carrier, and so the OEM is customizing things for the carrier. We don't actually have the carrier really called out here as another person that's slinging code on these devices, but.
And the two exceptions to that being both Apple and RIM, where they're both the OEM, effectively, and the vendor and the author of the OS. But specific to Android, that's where it gets really interesting for Android because you have sort of Android mainline, and then you have, ZTE's, LGE's, Huawei's Android.
Yeah.
And the level of customization there is a lot more than what you see on, as we said, like Dell's pre-installed version of Windows. It's not the same kind of deal.
No, it's not. And then so you have some Huawei phone that also has code on it written by Sprint. So you have a ton of companies throwing code on your device that don't, security is not always the primary focus, which is what we'll kind of come back to. So, and then the next layer down, the interesting layer that we'll talk a lot about is the hardware layer. So this is what actual hardware is running on the phone. This is the limiting factor on a lot of security that you can do. If you don't have crypto hardware, crypto is going to be too slow to do in real time. If you don't have a SOC that partitions out secure memory, you're not going to have secure memory, and no matter what the kernel does, it's still just a software bypass to beat it. For me, this is the interesting part, and we'll see later in the talk just how mobile hardware has evolved over the past 6 years.
Yeah, and I guess another point too is that if there are architectural problems with the security of that SOC, you're married to it, in that hardware.
Yeah,
in
this
a lot
is
of
the
cases.
same, it's the same problem that you have with SCADA, it's the same problem with industrial control, IoT, right? Once the hardware ships, once that thing's out in the wild, it's out there until someone throws it away. You rarely see firmware updates for a modem. You do, but it's not very common. You rarely see these things being kept up. And if it's actually in silicon wrong, it's in silicon wrong until it biodegrades. So the only thing left to talk about is the actual ARM spec. And I mean, there are non-ARM phones out there. We're going to kind of dismiss them for today, but you can find another specification. This is just basically the be-all, end-all. The ARM spec is released and gives you a baseline to expect the hardware will give you some sort of trusted execution environment. There's not a lot of interesting things in the ARM spec other than that it's just the lower baseline of expectation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's probably worth mentioning, and I think this is specifically an artifact of the fact that ARM was, designed very early on, for embedded processors and low power consumption, things like that, that it's a little bit different than the x86 spec, which has changed a lot over the years and has had sort of new pieces bolted onto it. In that ARM did have, from day one, pieces like Trust Zone and trusted execution environments and stuff like that were kind of unique.
Yeah, but I mean, chips can be released without that. The
Yeah.
chips do not have to follow the ARM spec.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's kind of where we get some interesting points for later. So this is just a summary slide to kind of summarize what we've talked about. In the black is the places that certain people can write code that's going to run on your phone. So you see the OEM can write all the lower level stuff. Some of the OEMs are big enough they can actually tweak the ARM spec. And then way up at the top is app developers in the App Store. So this is kind of just the breakdown of whose code you're looking at, whose applications you're looking at when you're running things.
Yeah, and I guess our first projectile at MDM, would be to make the point here, just to call it out there, that, it's important to realize that, when we think of MDM as being this sort of wrapper that solves the security problem in mobile for us, you need to understand where it integrates here in this stack, and how
it's
far up the stack
tiny.
it is. It's effectively just a hair below, most typical applications and things like that.
Yeah. Okay. So market share. These are going to be boring, lots of graphs. We're going to go fast. But just some high-level context of where we are today. So this is last year. If you look globally, the text is going to be too small. But on the right, the big blue area, that is the global deployment of Android. And the green is iOS. And then on this side is the US breakdown. So basically you see Android is huge worldwide. And it's still really, really, really big in the US. The iOS has a pretty big footprint. We're basically 50-50, with all of the other players combined taking just a couple percent.
And I think it's kind of interesting to think of it as iOS is sort of a first world platform, to a certain extent. And it's also, what's interesting about that as well is that on the other side of it, to the extent that we've seen real mass exploitation on mobile, a lot of that has been in other parts of the world outside of the US, and they've been targeted, specific countries, a lot of Asia, Japan, Korea, things like that. They have really high user base, a whole lot of mobile users, and those, all of those, typical, what we've seen so far, those have all been targeting Android, and I think, we think there's a couple reasons for that we'll probably jump to later.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, and you can also, I guess the other point this makes too is just that you can also see why we are sort of skimming over Windows and BlackBerry and some of the other mobile operating systems.
yeah, if you see that little green line that's kind of bouncing up and down at the bottom, that's iOS. Android's that big line. If you see that line that's trending down fast, right? That is RIM's rush to irrelevancy. Like they were totally
race to the bottom.
Which is sad because I really like their products. The last time we looked at them, they were solid. I kind of sad to see them go, but they are basically market irrelevance at this point. If you look at that line way at the bottom that's just kind of wiggling up, that's the Microsoft line. So they're still kind of relevant. They're trying to be relevant. They're not really growing, but they're not really losing market share either. So that they could be worthwhile to start paying attention to in a couple of years. And we'll talk about their hardware a little bit later. So again, kind of the same breakdown. This is just more data showing that Android is pretty much winning, but both Android and iOS are growing. And these are all global charts. Oh, it's moved. Oh, well, okay. So kind of the next thing to point out, now that we kind of see how all the OSs are distributed across the world, the big problem, the first thing you hear about Android is Android fragmentation, right? Things get released, new versions of the OS come out, because you have so many people writing code on these devices before they ship and tweaking code, they just don't do updates. So you don't traditionally see, the next version of Android come out for the phone you already bought. And that's one of the reasons why, is there's just the OEMs tweaked it, the carriers tweaked it, some other people have tweaked it. Like there's a lot of development work because they've kind of gone off.
Yeah, I mean, to circle back to the, like we were saying that, for a Dell laptop or something, they customize the default search bar and maybe change your default browser and make a couple other minor changes. They have, partnership agreements with people to pre-install particular applications and things like that, right? And you have all of those same things in mobile, in mobile vendors' releases of Android. Like all of that stuff's there. You guys know that. If you got a new Sprint phone, it's got certain apps that are pre-installed on it versus a Verizon phone versus a T-Mobile phone, right? But the deal is that with mobile, there's a certain, and I don't know that we know why this is really being done, other than maybe the fact that these are telecom and engineering firms and it's kind of how they think. But they're taking Android, open source Android, and modifying it at a lot greater level. So in addition to like your default search settings or whatever, they're writing their own messenger application, they're writing their own video player, they're writing kernel drivers for all of that. They're building their own reference for how they do trust zone or how they do locking and unlocking. Like all of those things are different for each one of those mobile Android releases. So the problem with that is that and we're try to be careful and respectful of our NDAs and things like that to like not specify vendors, but like so vendor X that makes an Android release and has an Android phone that they roll out. They have like, you have the entire Android dev team outside of that, that whole community, and they, the vendors participate in that, as well. But internally, you might have 10 people, right, who are doing everything they can to get that, that latest phone with the latest version of Android shipped and out the door. And as soon as that happens, they have this massive base of all of these mods and changes that they've done that are OEM specific and model specific in a lot of cases, right? So then what happens? A new release of Android comes out. That same group of people, in a lot of cases, it's all the same development problems you see everywhere else. That same group of people are now trying to catch up and do monkey patches for all of this junk that they had on the old release, get it pushed out to the new release of Android, release the official vendor X, version update to get you to the next release of Android, and also backport stuff to this older release. So what happens is they say, fuck it. That's what happens. Yeah. And they just stop maintaining it. And so this chart, I don't know, just to ask, anybody in the audience have seen this? I imagine quite a few have, right? It's an older. We haven't found a more recent version of this data, so we just went ahead and rolled with it. There are some other stats that Josh has on the next couple of slides, but the important point of this slide, which is still very true, is that Android vendors are releasing phones and they're basically expecting you to get rid of it in a year to 2 years, right? They're planning for that obsolescence. Apple has a much better track record of continuing to support, I have an ancient, really, iPhone and I need to get, a new one, but I'm waiting for, I think the 6s are too big. So I'm like, what, I can skip and I can still run the latest iOS, I don't care, And with Android, they really are expecting you to do that. The important point about that, though, which is, I guess, that next slide, is that not everybody can afford to do that. Yeah. In particular, that's of note when we talk about the fact, when we looked at first world adoption of Android and iOS versus the rest of the planet. And so the reality is that you have people in walk into a cyber cafe in Nairobi or something, and you're going to see people running phones that you haven't seen in 4 years. You're going to see handsets still on Froyo. Yeah. right, that are still out there, and they still have IP addresses on the global internet, and they're still doing stuff, right? And so that fragmentation, the people responsible for Android development across the board and sort of the ultimate sort of governing body is the Android development teams and Google and things like that. But the problem here is sort of beyond their control and has to do with these OEMs and how they bundle these things up, push them out, and then they don't get upgraded and they get abandoned.
So I mean, what we end up seeing with hard data here is just, if you look at Android, newest release is all the way over there. So you have not that many people on the newest release of the OS. More and more people back. You hit a peak about 2 versions back, and then it's spotty going all the way back to Android 2.2, which is really, 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 really ancient. It's like Windows 95 still out in the wild. It's kind of sad. So I mean, this is Android. This is what we see, right? If you look at Apple, here's the Apple trend. Like almost every device that's deployed globally is on the newest version or 1 version back. This is one reason when people still kind of claim that Apple is winning security. Like this is one reason why. It's not that they're necessarily better at security, but they are really good at getting their security updates out really fast. And that's because they're not burdened by an OEM. They're not really burdened by Sprint or any of the carriers.
Well, and you have the mentality, I think, too, among consumers. And it's interesting because I've been coming to Black Hat and speaking at Black Hat for a lot of years, right? And we used to, in the early 2000s, we would actually argue with people about why they needed to apply patches. Like I remember, running security for a company in the early 2000s and having to argue that we could do better than a 6-month patch cycle, right? That was just the default that everybody did back then. And of course, back then, internet worms and things like that sort of drove that home for people that you can't do that anymore. That you have to, stay in front of it's really the only means of control we have over our own security ultimately is vendor patches, right? That's really the only thing that we have any level of real control over. And so, what happens with that with Apple is I think most consumers now are pretty well trained to just click OK on a new update. Like my kids have iPhones. You guys probably have kids that have mobile devices, terrifying as that may be, and they are trained to hit OK on updates, right? Everybody is. And so my point of that is that I think a lot of the reason why that curve looks like that is also the fact that any phone out there, the vast majority of phones out there are still supported. So because of that, you don't have people that are lagging behind. And I think if there were backported updates available for a lot of these Android phones in the wild, I think their users would install those updates.
So the next thing to talk about, jumping down a little lower, is so I mean, all these phones at the basic level are kind of the same, right? They're a processor, they're a screen, they're a modem. There's not that many companies making processors for phones. There definitely wasn't a couple of years ago. So we can see right here, this big blue section is Qualcomm, right? They pretty much own the mobile SoC market. They had a much larger share a couple of years before this data. We're starting to see an uptick. Samsung, which is a huge behemoth powerhouse in the mobile space, right, has basically said we're shifting away from Qualcomm and everything's going to be with our own SoC. So that whole Samsung section used to also be Qualcomm. You're also seeing MTK and NVIDIA and Intel and a whole bunch of other people trying to move into the space. This is the 3rd or 4th kind of upsurge of SoC vendors trying to get on mobile devices. And it seems like every time 5 or 6 people come to market with a new mobile SoC and one of them makes it and gets market share. So we're seeing a lot of different hardware under the screen, which is really cool because that's where the actual interesting things come in. So in my mind, hardware starts at the SoC, right? Everything above that is nice to have, but I'm going to focus on that for a while. So we have a system on a chip. What are these things? Really high-level overview, a SoC, system on chip. It is your main processor, however many cores you have. Typically, it's also packaged in this little package. A lot of times it'll have a modem. It's got a lot of just other processing. It's got a GPU in there. It is a full computer on a chip.
So it's the other OS under the OS that you think about on your phone.
Yeah. Cool. So what does it run? Well, it runs Android. We kind of know that. We're expecting to know that. Before Android, it's basically running Linux kernel as a bootloader, which is a whole nother interesting topic. And then you also have QSE, Rex, Qt. You have a ton of little RTOSes and small little embedded OSs that are running on small little cores inside the SOC. So it's not just one computer that you're dealing with. It's actually a small little network on a chip. That's a good segue into trusted execution. What is this? Trusted execution is what's happening to make the phone actually function and work, right? This is below the OS layer. This is hardware trying to do hardware-y things. The intent of a trusted execution environment is there's things that happen in the phone that we want to have happen in a secure manner without everyone in this room being able to tweak it, right? That's the goal. So you have very hardware constricted and locked down devices. And then you normally have a hardware key that's saying, like, can I even debug this? Can I do anything at all with this?
And we'll jump to this, more later. But in jumping to the overall, question of sort of how does mobile security, where is mobile security more mature than desktop security, and where is it less mature? Down at this level in TEE and things like that, a lot of this stuff really does sort of meet that version of trusted computing that we were all sold was going to be happening any day now, across the board. So there's a lot of that that's really interesting. The devil's in the in the details.
The devil's in the detail, and a lot of it is being driven by companies like Netflix and DRM, like anti-piracy. We don't have them on the list before of people that are writing code that's getting down in your hardware, but they definitely are, right? That's where the keys for decryption are, for video streams and whatnot. So when we're looking at a phone, we can physically attack it, right? If I'm doing that, I get a screwdriver, I can take it apart, we can start probing pads. We can do a lot when we physically have it together. It's gonna take about $2,000 to get the hardware to be able to start poking at it. But other than that, they are an IoT device at that point. They're a SCADA device at that point. There's some sort of hardware that you can just play with.
Yeah, and what we're typically doing when we're doing this kind of thing, is we're assessing, for example, how trust zones implemented, or for what it's worth, even writing exploits for mobile. Like if anybody saw JDuck's Stage Fright talk last year, he did a pretty good job of like walking through what some of that process looks like. Mm-hmm. And so having the ability to attach to those lower level operating systems lets you do some debugging that could be useful for accessing those layers that are further up. Yeah. And we're typically doing that with engineering boards and things like that are, in some cases, not meant for people like us. They're meant for OEMs, but they're, of course, possible to obtain through various means. Yeah.
Cool. And I mean, the end goal, hopefully interesting attack surface, is to be able to do whatever you're doing locally, like recreate it in a remote environment, right? And so you kind of have to look at your attack surfaces there as basically the modem, because it's constantly going to be hanging out. You've got trust zone, which a lot of things can interact with, and then HLOS, which we already kind of get how to interact with.
HLOS being
high-level operating system.
Yeah, high-level operating system. We say HLOS, we're talking about Android, iOS, et cetera.
Yeah. So trust zone. Yeah, we'll go into this. Trust zone is, so in your mobile processor, you have cores that are doing processing. The very first core, core 0, is set up to actually host trust zone. In a nutshell, what trust zone is supposed to do is get a flag saying, I need to do something securely. And it drops everything else it's doing and stops and focuses just on the secure thing and maps new memory that's secure memory. It's doing everything in a secure mindset. So it's almost like a second processor or a fifth processor or whatever that's sitting out there just to do crypto, just to do DRM, just to do anything that is more sensitive that you don't trust the kernel to do. So this is the keys to the kingdom. If you want all the crypto keys on a phone, you're going to be attacking trust zone. Trust zone also does a lot of hardware configuration. So it is actually in control of the XPU that's turning around and setting permissions for access for everything else on the phone. So if you can tweak trust zone and get code execution on trust zone, there's really very little that you can't do on
Yeah,
the phone.
the security of the operating system is effectively irrelevant.
Yeah, you're under
Yeah.
it at that point,
Yeah.
and it's irrelevant.
So it's actually like, if this is, I should have ran that by you before I say it, but a kernel exploit versus a trust zone exploit, a trust zone exploit will potentially give you more access.
Yeah.
And so the thing we kind of wanted, and it's sort of just inside baseball kind of stuff, but the thing that we wanted to call out about this is that when you, as a security person, when you start learning about trust zone, like when we first did our first project we were looking at a number of years ago, you start reading the spec and you start reading about it and you get really excited. Like, this could be really awesome because this could actually do, some fundamental things with building, like I say, that dream of trusted computing that everybody's been telling us forever, that there's going to be this trust chain and everything will have boot integrity, and from day one, and a process can't install itself, anywhere else without, being approved by this master, through the magic of PKI, all these things are going to happen, right? And what's interesting is that there are just crap tons of brilliant cryptographers and billions of dollars, going into development on this, but it really does two things. It does Amazon Video and Netflix and whatever other video vendor you use. So all of this effort has really been about anti-piracy. So even though we have this whole trusted computing layer down here, it doesn't do any of the security things that you would think it does, right? It really is just about protecting content.
And I mean, they've tried to do like digital voting using Trust Zone, and that didn't necessarily go great. There's been a lot of work trying to figure out how we can kind of take it back and use it for something more interesting than DRM.
Yeah.
But that's not well funded.
Yeah, and what's unfortunate is that you then have this problem that you're taking and you're arming, like preschoolers with Uzis, because you have people that are developing against these APIs that run at this really low privilege level, but their objective is to make sure that your video doesn't jitter when you watch a movie on the plane or something like that. Like that's what this is all doing. And so what that means is that, like I say, if you have a trust zone exploit, or exploits in the media player layers and things like that on Android phones, those are just, bullet train to kernel town at that point. And so it's unfortunate, that's how it's played out.
We've seen devices ship out in the wild where, as we were pointing out earlier, there's a lot of people that can write code that go into Trust Zone. So Trust Zone comes out of Qualcomm fairly secure and robust. Like, it's a decent attempt. It's really hard to break. But so many other OEMs and carriers get to write code. Some other people get to write code that gets shoved down in there. And the accidental exposure to things like, there's a function called please give me root, right? It's ridiculous how bad some of the code that we see inside Trust Zone is, that basically just opens it all up. Because once you get through the doors, everything's open. There's no partitioning and security inside. So baseband. Baseband is another trusted execution environment. So you have Trust Zone that's doing a lot of crypto and protecting things and kind of connected to the operating system. And then you have the modem. The modem is sitting out there talking to the cell towers and whatnot. Generally, comms are coming from modem to Trust Zone or from modem to the high-level operating system directly. But normally it's to Trust Zone. And this is another, there's been some research in the community on this. Sadly, there's not a lot we can actually get away with talking about.
Yeah, well, I think that, fun, like, big picture is, it's the same thing that as we're talking about with Trust Zone, that something that's unique about mobile, and when we talk about Trust Zone, it really applies to just Android, but when we talk about baseband, of course, it applies to any mobile operating system, is that, like I say, when somebody asks me what's the difference between your laptop and your desktop from a security perspective, one of those differences is these other pieces that you interact with that run at low level and have low level of privileges. So in order to do things like switch between 4G and LTE and tell your mobile device that has just happened, or that your carrier is switched, or you're roaming on a network, or any of those kind of things, there are a lot of hooks and integrations down there at a very low level. So just like with Trust Zone, what that means is that baseband exploits, by definition, are going to have keys to the kingdom, as Josh likes to say.
Yeah, complete keys to the kingdom.
And there's a lot of squares of various colors,
There are.
shapes.
We're going to jump through modem a little bit. there's some things we can't talk about in there. Bootloader. So this is kind of the other, when you're looking at phones in general, you're looking at trusted execution environments, there's always a handful of them, right? You're 99% of the time going to have trust zone. If it's cell phone, I hope you have a modem or baseband, or it's not really a cell phone. You also have the bootloader, which typically is running on a different processor than everything else on the phone. That processor gets reused later once the phone boots, but this processor's sole job is to make sure that secure boot is followed and that we're booting up in a trusted fashion. This is the cornerstone to Android security if you're gonna try to get full ownership and control of the device. The first place to attack is secure boot, at least. So this is running through. It does have apps. They're really simple. Secure boot's tiny. And there's a lot of good documentation on secure boot from just talks we've done in the past.
Yeah, and I mean, everybody, I presume most of the people in this room have rooted or jailbroken a phone, right?
Yeah.
So you were interacting at that point with the bootloader. I mean, from a security perspective, where it comes into play, it is, physical access type attack, right? But, it is at the point where you haven't sort of built, you don't have boot integrity at that point, and whatever's running is still kind of untrusted until you bootstrap and move into those upper, layers in the OS. And so, exploits, bootloader exploits, local exploits. But I mean, I don't know that we'll ever solve that problem. I mean, in fairness, all of the, I'd say Apple probably spent the most effort, thinking about that problem, and I don't think, but we'll see what they say in that talk that's coming up right today.
Yeah.
But I think everybody I've ever talked to has sort of accepted jailbreaking is always going to be a reality, right?
Hopefully. So QFuses, this is pretty much the last piece of hardware we'll talk about. So QFuses the Q stands for Qualcomm, so these are Qualcomm specific, but fuses in general are used in a lot of hardware. You'll see them regardless if it's mobile or not mobile, right? They're used everywhere. They're used really heavily in the Xbox. So fuses are basically a way it's a slab of, kind of little old school fuses. You can blow them, and that sets a permanent key. So in phones, you have normally about 16K worth of fuses that can be used to write all your security keys, all your other keys, everything else that you want to permanently have on that phone. They're physical hardware fuses. So once they're blown, there's no unblowing them. So a lot of the goal when you're doing kind of a forensic or just like, I want the keys, I want to get in this phone and get everything I can as fast as I can. The first question is, what fuses can I read right now? And can I actually read the fuses that have the keys? Because I don't have to do anything else if I can just read those. TrustZone actually does a lot of the protections for the fuses. So if you end up going down that path for research, you'll actually start at TrustZone and then go to fuses from TrustZone. So to kind of sum this whole mentality up, is we've seen, Qualcomm is the majority of the hardware out there. Samsung LSI is kind of the number 2 in getting bigger, right? So if you're sitting on some bug that is a Qualcomm bug, and it's a pure Qualcomm TrustZone bug, it's going to work on 60, 70% of the phones out on the market today, technically, right? If you can get that code executing, it should run, and it should it's the same hardware. And so you can have cross-device bugs. You can truly have the same bug that'll work on Apple, Android, RIM, and Windows Phone. Like that is technically possible. And we've seen a handful of designs of an attack in most of the attacks. Some of the code changes, some of the tweaks change. But we've seen things that work on both like a Nokia Windows Phone and an Android phone. That's not horribly uncommon. So you get, which is something you don't really get in many other cases, is like cross-OS exploitation.
So that applies to, both across OEMs in the Android case and also across operating systems. If you jump back to those market share slides, right, even at best, it's a 50-50 split in the US, right, between iOS and Android. So it sort of raises the point that vulnerabilities in these lower level areas, you know, are going to save an attacker a lot of development time effectively, right? So, and they're also going to be off the radar, you know, and you don't see, you know, bootloader and baseband updates and things like that happen at the same frequency with OS updates. And so you have scenarios with that, you know, for us, we think make it very interesting. And I think like one of the goals of this talk was just to get people thinking about all those other pieces and how they come into play. Yeah. Yeah, and so, yeah, I mean, just kind of some general thoughts along that same line, just to sort of talk about BYOD and MDM in general. I mean, general security conferences, Black Hat, you know, rant, right? Again, like I say, a lot of what talks here are about individual bugs and individual findings by individual researchers. And they're sort of out of context of any kind of larger picture of that. The thing I always try to remember is that most of the people in this room are going to go home and have a network that they have to secure. Actually, I mean, we all do at least have a home network or something like that. But like, you know, a lot of the people in the audience here at Black Hat go home and defend their corporate networks. You know, and we watch Chris and Charlie blow cars up and all that. But, you know, at the end of the day, we're all, you know, most of us are running security operations somewhere, and most of us have responsibilities for that. What I'm hoping is that now maybe you see that bigger picture of these other layers of exploitation and also all of that fragmentation for Android in particular. I hope that you realize that this mentality that the information security industry likes to apply to everything, which is to take our godfather John McAfee's disposable razor blade model and just keep reapplying it to everything else of let's buy a piece of software that's going to make us safe and then update it and sell you subscription updates. Like that model with MDM, what I hope you understand is that if there's an exploit in baseband or trust zone, if there's any of these low-level components that are exploited, by definition, your MDM's not going to protect you for that, right? And also just to make that point that because of that level of fragmentation, if you're doing BYOD and you're also pushing down like a corporate MDM when people enroll and things like that, it's our position that what you should also be doing is sort of, I guess, BYOD with a sort of an asterisk at the bottom, that what we would suggest is support only, you know, particular versions. And I have seen a number of corporate deployments where it has not occurred to them at all to worry about what OS their users are running, you know, and things like that. So what I would like to see, and I've seen in a few corporate environments, is, you know, specifically supporting flagship Android that's as close to mainline as possible with as few OEM tweaks as possible, which really kind of means Nexus, right? And same thing with iOS, you know, most recent, like 2 releases of an iPhone. And I think what's important about that is, like, again, to go back to that, if you look at that hierarchy and how permissions work and all that kind of stuff, you can see that, you know, this MDM piece is very, very far up in that stack. And any vulnerabilities in that lower operating system or in baseband or in trust zone or in the bootloader, all those things, just shut that stuff off. And when we do an MDM assessment, that's what we do for boot, right? We just break that. And frankly, it's always a speed bump at best, you know? And so I don't think that, I'm not going to tell people not to run MDM by any stretch, but I think, again, the security industry likes to sell people simple solutions to complicated problems. And I guess the point, if nothing else, of this talk is that the problem is pretty complicated. And the simple solution is probably not going to solve it. Cool. So, trying to think. Yeah, I mean, I guess, yeah, do we do Q&A? We have microphones. I guess we do.
Sure.
Sure.
If we have any questions, we'd love to hear 1 or 2.
Cool. Okay. Or you're free to go. Okay. Enjoy.
Thank
Enjoy
you.
your coffee. Thank you.